Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Crop. I'm Anna Heslop and today my guests are John McCaw and David Birkett from the Herbage seed subsection of Federated Farmers. Welcome, John.
Thanks,
David.
Anna. Thank you.
Now, Herbage seed subsection has been very active this year looking at how much it actually costs to grow a crop, and you've developed a cost of production spreadsheet specifically for that purpose. So what's sort of driving that?
So it was done in response to grower concerns around a lack of profitability in herbage seed production. And it's not something new. It's actually been happening over the last decade with relatively static pricing and yield and increasing costs. What we've seen on the back of a very poor harvest is an exponential increase in our input costs. And we're all familiar with the global pressures that are behind that. But the timing of the contracts that we signed for this season now that we're in was out of sync with that rapid increase in our production costs. So what we have now is a situation where our pricing is just not keeping up. And so unless we have a very good harvest, growers won't be making money growing grass. So we responded to that, and what we had was some frustration in the industry. And on the back of that, you had groups of growers, and you had the arable section of Federated Farmers, you had the herbage seed subsection, everyone doing good things, good work, but in a fragmented way. And so we saw a need to sort of bring everyone together and to try and develop a set of numbers that was representative of the cost of growing ryegrass in New Zealand. And then those numbers could be used as the basis of the discussion between growers and industry. And so from that, it actually morphed into a drive to understand those costs, but not only a gross margin, which is, I guess, the traditional way of looking at the cost of growing and profitability, but actually looking at a net margin. And so a net margin is when you take the overhead costs of running your business into account and you divide that across the productive area of your farm. And so what we set out to do was to understand those costs, and we did that with this cost of production spreadsheet. And it gives growers a tool to then analyse the particular contract for a particular variety of grass on their farm and understand whether or not that contract is sufficient for them to make money.
So how have you been working with the firms on this?
So from the outset, we didn't want to bang the table and say we need this much money per kilogram. That's too simplistic and it's too combative. We wanted to work collaboratively with the firms, and indeed we did. They were involved in the creation of the spreadsheet. We then went and individually met with 11 firms and in a bit of a roadshow, and it was very, very well received and well supported. And the call for improved grower pricing was well supported by industry. So it has been a very positive experience working through that with the firms. And I think because of those discussions and that interaction, we now have a particularly strong relationship, and the scene is set for change, better than perhaps it's ever been in the past. And I think a lot better than if we had been more combative, as perhaps we have been in the past.
Thanks, John. David, a spreadsheet is basically a calculator. So you put in the figures that are appropriate for your farm in a range of columns and it comes up with your costs. So what is that spreadsheet actually telling you?
Well, we're in a new paradigm of pricing inputs into our system. And that's something that we've never experienced at these levels before, with the increase in fertiliser price, chemical prices, and essentially all associated inputs into our farming system. The spreadsheet's been really vital in allowing us to look at that and saying, we knew what it was in the past. I think most arable farms had a good idea what the gross margin of the crop was on the old pricing. But when it came to these new pricings, they didn't really have an understanding of how to go about to get those new input costs in. So that's what the spreadsheet does for us. And as well, it allows us to look at the net profit as well, or loss. And so what it's told us really is the industry's got a real challenge in front of it to be sustainable and profitable. What it really showed was, from a gross margin point of view, Some varieties and at some pricings were a small gross margin loss or a gain, somewhere around that break-even point. But once we put into the net margin, so all the operational costs on the farm, that quickly turned into a loss for that particular crop. So, that's something that I think as an industry we need to start talking about a bit more, is around our net margins versus our gross margin, because at the end of the day, that's the one that's going to be on our balance sheet and the one that's the most important. So I guess it's told us that, one, we've got a challenge around profitability, and there's two components to that. And the spreadsheet has already told us that one of those components, which is yield, is highly important. When we put in the high-yielding varieties, they quite often showed that they were profitable. But when we get some of the newer varieties, which appear to be more lower yielding, those were the ones which were giving us the largest loss on the results. So I guess it's told us and the industry that if we've got new lower yielding varieties coming into the industry, then they do need to be priced accordingly in order for them to be grown at a profitable state. Are
the yield predictions available, and are they realistic when growers are buying that seed?
It's a really good question, Anna. That's one thing I think farmers should ask agents when they're coming up their drive. Not what is your potential for the crop, because quite often an agent will tell you the better yields that they've had from that variety. What we'd like to see from the seed companies is the average yield or the mean yield from those varieties, because that's the number that we need to have in to put into the calculator, so we do get a true and accurate number, and from that number we can make a decision whether we believe that crop is a viable one for us, or whether there are other crops in our cropping system which have more potential to create a profit for us.
So are yield and price the only things you should be considering looking at those contracts?
No, they're not. In recent years, we've been able to negotiate some improvement on some of the terms of contracts. And so that's something to look out for in this year's coming contracts. So what I mean by terms is things like payment timings. Some of those may be brought forward by some companies to give a better cash flow for us. Other ones may be who incurs some of those post-gate costs. So certification costs, purity and germination tests, and even the cost of the bags come dressing. So those are some of the things that you need to look at in the coming contracts to see who's paying for those costs and what proportion. It may be a proportion of those costs may be paid by grower or the company. So all that information can actually be put into the spreadsheet and can be calculated out on the spreadsheet to give you an accurate answer on each variety.
Is it tricky to use the spreadsheet? How long is it going to take you?
No, it's not that tricky. There's a lot of preoccupied squares or tabs on it. So it might be full cultivation or minimum till or direct drilling, or it might be a percentage of a base figure. So no, I think it's pretty basic to follow through. I think anyone should be able to pick it up and follow the prompts on the screen and come up with a pretty accurate answer to what they're wanting to need to make a good decision.
I think what we've tried to do there is find a balance between having these boxes that David mentioned where you can choose the parameter, you can change that parameter, and those are the ones that you as a grower will know. You'll know whether you did this cultivation or that cultivation or whatever. And then in terms of the other ones that you as a grower may not know, which we're talking more about your overhead costs, they've been pre-populated and they can't be changed. So any grower should be able to sit down in a matter of minutes without having to go back through their records or anything like that, and they will be able to populate that spreadsheet. And as they do so, they own the information that it's coming out the bottom. So if I was to give you a spreadsheet that was pre-populated and said, here, look at this is for ryegrass, you wouldn't really have much buy-in. You'd go, oh yeah, but that's not really me. If you start at the top and you fill it in for a particular paddock, a particular crop on your farm, that means something by the time you get to the bottom of it, and that's that paddock, and that's how much I'm either making or I'm not making it. And it's a lot more personal, it's a lot more interesting, and hopefully a lot more useful to the grower.
Okay, so we've got the spreadsheet. We've had industry involved with its development. Are we going to see some changes in pricing in these contracts in the next wee while? Yes
and no. Yes, we will. we're quite confident that we will see a significant lift in pricing. The no relates to whether that lift in pricing will correlate with what the spreadsheet says we need. And there's a lot of factors to consider there. And the main ones are actually outside of our control and outside the control of the firms that we're working with. So whilst the firms appreciate that there is a need for a higher gross return for farmers, we have to, as a country, compete in an international market. We're already a long way away from that market compared to other production centres, and everybody's aware of the COVID-related supply chain issues. So we already have to compete on that basis. There is a limit to how much value our firms can extract out of the international market, and therefore how much of a price increase as growers we can expect.
Is this something that the overseas seed producers are dealing with as well?
Yeah, look, Northern Hemisphere had a good harvest, particularly in Denmark last year, about 20% up by the sound of it on normal production, which is nearly about half of what we produce in New Zealand. So it's a significant amount. And there is a softening in the market in the Northern Hemisphere. Obviously, the war in Ukraine, pandemic, it's all having a flow-on effect in the general public. And so they are seeing some softening in sales. But I guess we are lucky that we have a good, strong domestic economy here from a proprietary point of view on seeds. And that still looks strong. And there's, that seed stock in New Zealand was pretty low after last year's harvest. So we think that those domestic proprietary varieties will be in demand or available. But it's really this international multiplication area that's the larger concern, I guess. And that's the area we were probably seeing a growth in the last 4 or 5 years.
The challenges that New Zealand growers face in terms of inflationary pressures and things like that, that's not New Zealand centric, that's a global issue. So in answer to your question, I think growers in other key areas, and we're talking Oregon, we're talking Denmark, Tasmania, they're all facing the same pressures and they're all having the same conversations. And so there will be a global lift in pricing over time. Unfortunately, because of our position on the globe, we are not always in sync with other production areas. And that we certainly missed out on a price spike last year that other growers were benefited from. New Zealand just simply didn't see that. So
what's your advice to growers as people are coming down the drive with contracts to sign?
I think you're in a position of strength and you need to appreciate that. The grower base has shrunk. There are good areas, have been good areas. We're yet to see the area of production that will be on offer. But as a grower, you are a highly skilled member of the supply chain, and they do value us as growers. So don't feel that you have to sign the first contract. Use the spreadsheet would be the key thing, because you're going to be faced with a range of pricing and a range of terms, and it's going to be very hard to distill that down without the spreadsheet. It's a tool that we can use to unite the industry and to make informed decisions instead of just agreeing to grow because you always have.
And so we're expecting in the long term that things are going to level off, or what's going to happen?
I think the demand's there globally. The Northern Hemisphere is quite often struggling with climate conditions and things that we don't seem to see quite the extremes that they do. So I think, the potential's there, and, things change pretty quickly. 2 years ago, the Southern Hemisphere was a great place to produce seed. And here we are 2 years later, and being in the Southern Hemisphere is probably one of the big hamstrings that we have at the moment around getting costs and shipping up to the Northern Hemisphere. So, but I think, if you look out into the future, the number of places that can grow these temperate herbage seeds is pretty few in the world. And we're probably going to be one of the more stable places in the world. So, price depending, the opportunity to grow them here is good. But I guess we've got to realise that we are in a global market. And some of those factors that determine global pricing have very little to do with cost of production, which is something we're going to have a look at and trying to understand a little bit better. Is that why isn't cost of production a key component of international pricing? Because at the moment it doesn't appear to be so.
So where can growers actually find this spreadsheet? That's quite an important question.
Probably the easiest way to find the spreadsheet is through the link in the weekly newsletter from FAR. It's hosted on the Fed's News website, which is fednews.co.nz.
So that's just a matter of you download that, fill it up with your own numbers, and then you can save it, and it's there to alter or use again.
That's a really good point, because you can actually view it online. If you do that, you don't have the same functionality. So make sure you hit the download button, get yourself a copy, and then you're free to use it on your own time and your own machine.
Okay, thanks, David and John. So that's the advice. Download the spreadsheet, populate it with your data, save it, and use that information that you gain from that to make sure that you're getting a price that works for your crop on your farm. And in the meantime, have a great day on the farm.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.